Okay, and welcome to the podcast. Me and Travis were already talking here, and I said, man, I need to fire up the microphone because he was just giving me his background, and I found it interesting, and I think you will too. So we're going to just jump right into it here. I should say that my guest today is Travis Henline, historian, but he also was saying that his job currently is in Morgantown.
Yes.
And the name of the...
Main Street, Morgantown.
Main Street, Morgantown.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But the reason why we're here today is to talk about history, and I was excited to just learn that he worked at Colonial Williamsburg. Specifically, we were just getting into talking about what he was doing in relation to Native American relations with Williamsburg. So we'll continue from right there.
Well, yeah, like I said, when I was hired at Colonial Williamsburg, they had gotten a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to begin Native American programming. And I was hired into that position as the first coordinator of what we call the American Indian Initiative. And a lot of research went into that initially. And then the biggest part of my job was relationship building. So I spent a lot of time building relationships with those Native peoples who had historical associations, not only with Williamsburg, but with Virginia generally, Williamsburg being the colonial capital. And the first of those were the Virginia Indian Nations. There presently, at that time, there were 8 state-recognized tribes in Virginia. I don't think a lot of people realize that.
I had no idea.
There were 8 now there's 10 state-recognized tribes, and they have their first federally recognized tribes, which are the Pamunkey. And the Pamunkey Indians, Pocahontas, or Matoaka, as they called her, was descendant from the Pamunkey. So her people are now a federally recognized tribe in Virginia. But it was important that I began there and established those relationships with those folks and put a lot of time and effort into that. And it bore fruit, and they came on board with what we were trying to do. I mean, the whole idea was to give them a voice in the interpretation of their history, because heretofore, a lot of museums took the approaches, that they would... They were going to tell their story as they saw it, without even asking. And one of the things you don't do when you're developing these types of programs with Native people is you don't go to them and say, hey, this is what we want to do. What do you think? Because at that point, you've already decided what you just want to feel. Want to feel better about yourself.
Right.
But at any rate, so I developed those relationships with Virginia Indians, and the next step was to reach out to those tribes who were without the state of Virginia but associated with the history. Principal among those were the Cherokee. 14 delegations over a 25-year period came to Williamsburg. So I reached out to the Eastern Band in North Carolina, the Oklahoma Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. Got them on board with what we were doing, started relationships with them, started programming with them, and those are relationships that still continue down there to this day. But at that time, we were talking about my trajectory, my path, I guess, with the National Park Service and Colonial Williamsburg. But then I was also hired. That was a contract job for the first 2 years, and then they hired me on to do it permanently. I was a manager in what we called the Department of Public History Development at Colonial Williamsburg. And I was responsible for the Indian Initiative and also 4 sites in the town, because it is a whole town. It is the largest living history museum in the world.
It's an amazing place.
It's huge. It's a whole town. And so I was responsible for the Capitol, which to me, I won the lottery because that was where everything exciting to me happened. The political stuff, all the discourse, all the events for the Revolution. The courthouse, public jail, and what we call the Peyton Randolph House, which was a principal site for urban slavery interpretation. So I worked a lot with the African-American interpreters there as well on that programming. And then eventually we transitioned back to West Virginia, and I ended up working for the West Virginia Division of Culture and History here in Wheeling as the site manager of West Virginia Independence Hall. Different history, different era, statehood, Civil War, also great stuff. And I really loved that history as well. But that's kind of how I got started on the public history gig, which has kind of been my thing for a while now. So.
What attracted you to Native American history? Because to me, I find Native American culture very fascinating, more so from just the lifestyle and the way they live within the land, and to me, it seems like a much better way to live. But what attracted you specifically? Because I was talking to Hal on Sunday, right in this very spot, and And he was more interested in a little bit more modern history. So
Sure.
It got me thinking about how broad history is. And so how did you kind of get?
Well, it has been, among other things, it's been a journey of self-discovery.
Right.
We had always known and talked about in our family that there were two specific individuals who had Native ancestry in our family lineage, in my mother's family. And the closest to those would be, for me, 6 generations removed. But still, I was interested in that. I'd always heard about it, at Thanksgiving dinner after you eat and you start talking and people tell stories. These Native ancestors came up in conversation. So I began to look into that when I was about 18, 19, when I got to WVU and started doing some research on my own. And it kind of just went from there. There was a Native student organization on campus, the Organization for Native American Interests. And I went to their first meeting, and I dug what they were about and what they were doing, got involved with that organization, eventually was the president of the organization for a couple of years. And that's really where my, starting public programming on campus, that's where it all started. When I was an undergrad, we started producing, we had the American Indian Heritage Week in the spring. We had a whole litany of different programs and events for that. Fundraising, that's when I started learning how to fundraise from different departments, social justice, women's studies, if we had a woman speaker, and et cetera, et cetera. And so in undergraduate, that's how I started on that whole trajectory. So that was the impetus for it. And then in graduate school, my master's thesis dealt with Lord Dunmore's War of 1774, which Fort Henry did play a part, in Pittsburgh in particular as well, in the Battle of Point Pleasant, down in Point Pleasant. But obviously the Shawnee are the other side of that conflict. And so began to research more and more of that. Got involved in living history. So I was one of these guys that started dressing up and going to all these living history events.
Nice.
And so met a lot of people, and there's some really knowledgeable people out there who do that. And got me interested in that, the material culture aspect of it and things like that. And just did a lot of my own research, but also my master's level history research was focused on Native aspects of the colonial period. And then it translated into a job. Like I said, I worked as an interpretive ranger for Fort Necessity National Battlefield, and my job there was to give the Indian perspective on the French and Indian War. Again, at Prickett's Fort State Park in Fairmont, West Virginia, I did Native programming there and gave that other side. Which was important because obviously you pull up to a stockade fort, the narrative straightway is one of conflict,
right?
And so it was important to give balance to that story, and then that led to the work at Colonial Williamsburg.
And it's a great area, I think, to have someone that's an advocate for the other side, because I know when I was growing up, when they spoke of Native Americans, they called them Indians, and they were the savages, and they were the enemy, and
sure.
and anybody that killed them was a hero, and
sure.
and it's just just recently, at least in my lifetime, that people are starting to have a different perspective, and which I think is important, and
it's been a long time coming. I can tell you, having been out there working, it's interesting when you work with the public with these subjects in particular, because you hear all sorts of comments and you get to understand people's perceptions about those things. There is a profound ignorance among the general populace when it comes to Native peoples and their history. But I have to try to understand that.
Sure.
And what I've come to understand is people simply do not know.
Yeah.
You're not taught this in school. This is an ugly chapter and some very dark things that's not part of your curriculum.
Right.
As I grew older, I began to understand that curriculum has agenda,
right.
And there was nothing about Native people other than they killed Custer. That's what I remember from high school history
class.
That's
what I remember too.
They killed Custer.
Yeah, right.
He had a bad day. So that's all you don't know. You're not taught these things, and of course they're savages. But they had to be savages because they had to be the other.
Yeah.
You can't do nasty things to people that are humans. They have to be savages. They have to be Krauts. They have to be Gooks. They have to be something other.
Yeah.
So that you can do these things to them.
Yeah, you have to dehumanize them.
They had to be savages. Yeah. It's but what the other side of that is the profound ignorance, like I said. But the other side of that is that people are fascinated by Native history and culture. I've I've had that beautiful opportunity to see people stand there, and while you speak to them and tell them things, and their stereotypes just start to shatter and fall off and pile up around their feet. And wow, I didn't know that. Well, that makes sense now. Well, that's pretty fascinating. They're interested. They want to know more. And Native American studies as an area of study, whether it be in anthropology, history, or what have you, hasn't really had its day until recently, in the past maybe 2 decades. As one of my college professors said, it's academically hot right now. Right. It's a hot topic now that people want to study. And you have to remember that until the 1970s and the social history revolution, people didn't really write about or research women, blacks, Indians, minorities, the poor. Yeah. It was all about, the white upper crust males to that point. So
Civil War, World War I, World War II.
Nothing else happened.
Yeah.
And the white guys who led it all.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that was a new thing in academia, which, when it comes to public history, museums, things like that, it seems like it takes that change in academia first, and then it finds its way out to the museums and the public history sites. But it's been a big couple of decades for Native studies.
Well, and I think what's cool is that you're not only educating people as to the history, but you're also changing the perspective on a whole group of people, which hopefully, if they have a different view of Native Americans after going on a tour with you or meeting you, that then they then look at other groups of people and wonder, well, maybe I've been wrong about other things.
Right. There's a snowball effect there, and one of my favorite things to do that I have done is that when you bring in Native people for programming, like I had a group of Eastern Band Cherokee come in for special weekends of programming, and you put them out there with the public, and it's fascinating because most of these people have never met a quote-unquote real Indian before.
True, yeah.
And so basically you're facilitating a site of first contact.
Yeah.
First contact still happens.
Right.
And so people are meeting Native people for the first time. And number one, they realize, oh, my God, you guys, you're still here.
Yeah, right.
You're still here. Yeah. Number two, that, hey, you have a history and you have a culture and it's vibrant, it's alive, you still practice it. Yeah. A lot of folks still speak their native language, although that's being lost at a rapid rate. But they're just blown away.
And I think that most people, I know enough to be dangerous about Native American, but that it was actually much more organized and bigger than I think we learned in high school. We thought they were people living in little groups in tents, but there was a pretty organized society.
Cities, my friend.
Yeah.
When you think about Cahokia, which was in Illinois, which was, Cahokia's decline, near St. Louis, present-day St. Louis. Cahokia's decline, they believe, was around in the 15th century. But Cahokia at its height had over 20,000 residents.
Wow.
At that time, that made it more populous than any other European city at the time.
Wow.
It was a trading center. When you think of Mesoamerica, when you think about the cultures of Aztecs and Mayans, and you think about the development there, how complex, they had a system of writing. Yeah. They had codexes. They had a hieroglyphic system of writing. They had books. The Spanish burned all the damn books.
Yeah.
Except for a few, but they had books of knowledge that went back hundreds of years. They had very advanced civilizations. They had concepts of mathematics that were far ahead of Europeans at one particular time. And so, this whole idea of the dirt scratching savage, well, again, it's all part of that narrative that you have to be fed. You have to think that this was an empty landscape, because otherwise, it was taken from someone.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, what people don't realize, and there's a great book that's published a few years ago, 1491, America's Before Columbus. Charles Mann is the author, 1491. And what Mann has done is he's pulled together all the research that's been done in the past several decades, starting to take a real hard look again at pre-contact North and South America. And there's some fascinating stuff, not the least of which is that there were millions of people. Wow. Millions of people. Now, the estimates will vary, depending on which researcher you talk to. Some have them as high as 60 million people.
Wow.
In the Americas. Okay, and so what happened? Why, when the Zanes come to Wheeling on the Ohio River, are there hardly any Native people around? Not that there weren't, because there were. Yeah. There's several villages here, and we'll talk about that. But where did all these? Where were these people who built this? this giant mound down in Moundsville? Where are these people who created all these earthworks in Newark, Ohio, and Marietta, Ohio? Where are they? They've been gone for a long time. Well, a lot of things happen, not the least of which is what I call the greatest biological disaster in human history, which is the meeting of the old world and the new. The Europeans brought diseases, smallpox, diphtheria, the common cold, later with the importation of African slaves, malaria. And so these diseases absolutely devastate Native people. Yeah. Devastate them. Epidemics that wipe out thousands and thousands and thousands, if not millions of people, okay? And you have, when you go down to look at the Mesoamerican stuff, there are actually illustrations that were done during this period, you're talking about the 1500s going into the 1600s, where there's just, these illustrations of people with little dots all over themselves laying everywhere because people were just dying. And so the estimates that I've read is that by the time the first Englishman, really dips his toe in the sand down at Jamestown, most of these people have died. Okay, so some of these, especially Mesoamerica with the Spanish, when they come in there, millions. Okay, so the estimate I've seen is 9 out of 10.
Wow,
that's 90%. I think about the Pilgrims. If you think about the story of the Pilgrims, they show up in Massachusetts and they come across these native villages that are completely empty.
Yeah,
God has prepared the way.
Right.
Okay, it's the city on the hill, right? No, smallpox has wiped them out.
Wow.
They're gone, man. And so everything has, and I tell my students this, by the time the first settlements at Jamestown occur, up in Massachusetts at Plymouth, everything has already changed. Their whole world has already been flipped upside down.
Yeah.
And so tribes that were in power are decimated, are no longer in power. There's shifts in political power. There's shifts in population. This group, whoever's left, gets absorbed into this group, and they become acculturated. All this is happening before Jamestown is even settled, because the traders who are bouncing along the coast in the late 14th or 1500s principally. Yeah, the Spanish who were down in Mesoamerica. What are they doing? They're leaving behind all these trade goods they're bringing.
Yeah.
The microbes are going, and what happens with these trade goods? Well, these are fascinating objects. People want them, and so they're taking them like copper kettles, or beads, or clothing, or weapons, and they're trading them to the interior tribal people, and so these microbes are traveling with the stuff. Yeah. And before you know it, half your village is laying dead with these little bumps all over them.
And I don't think people realize that as the Europeans, yes, they died from these diseases, but what you had, because these diseases has run rampant for years, is they come from the surviving stock. So even though they were susceptible to it, they came, their parents and their grandparents and their ancestry were basically people that had developed the ability to at least survive the worst of it, and but the Native Americans had no background biome basically
they have no immunity.
Yeah, nothing at all.
They had no immunity, and so it ran through them.
Probably in a way that we can't understand.
No, there's no comparison. There's no comparison ever in history. Yeah. Charles Mann calls it the Great Dying.
Wow.
The Great Dying. And so it changed everything. And so when you think about the Zanes, and you think about Fort Henry and the Indians who were attacking Fort Henry in the 17th, those are the people who survived. Yeah. They are descended from the people who survived, which again is 9 out of 10 gone. So everything changed.
So you're really educating me, because I always thought that, in my uneducated knowledge of this, is that it was because we had more firepower. I didn't realize that Mother Nature had done most of the work for us.
Disease killed more Indians than firearms or anything else.
I had no idea. I always thought that it was because we had firearms and higher quality, more advanced weapons. But
no. And here's another point to make when you think about weaponry in particular. Early on, yes, perhaps an initial contact, but what's the number one trade item with Native people? Guns.
Yeah.
Okay, and so I have to tell people, they would come to a program, and Colonial Williamsburg with Native. Where are your bow and arrows? sorry, they haven't been using those for decades because they've been training for guns.
See, in the movies, the old westerns, they were being, it was bows and arrows versus guns. It was portrayed wrong.
It's terrible, but that is a little bit different history. That's Western history, and the trade begins later in time out there. But here in the Eastern Woodlands, part of the reason that there are very few Native people in the Ohio Valley when the Zanes come out here to Wheeling is that there has been a spreading out from the valley. There's been sort of a diaspora, and it has to do in part with guns, because up in what was New Netherland first with the Dutch became New York, the Iroquois people, the tribes of the Iroquois Confederacy, have been trading for a long time now. They're trading beaver pelts, which was the number one fur. It was called round gold. Beaver pelts were used to make beaver felt hats, which was all the rage and fashion in Europe. So they're trading for guns to kill the beaver, among other things, among other items they're trading for. I always tell my students this is, when Indians became Walmart shoppers. It started really, really early.
Sure.
They want the stuff. They like the stuff. And so guns are the big thing. So if you have boomsticks and your neighbors don't, already you're in a military advantage.
Yeah.
But also it helps you hunt more efficiently for the beaver pelts and deer pelts. You get more pelts to get more of the stuff, and you become consumers.
Yeah.
You become part of an economy, a consumer economy, which it's a sea change in Native culture. And so what the Iroquois do is they kill them all. They kill all the beaver in their region. So they have to press to the west, and they pretty much wipe out a group of Indians called the Erie, or the Cat Indians. They make their way across Pennsylvania. They need more trapping grounds to get more beavers, to get more stuff. And so they make their way down into the upper Ohio Valley, where we're sitting right now. And the native people here haven't had access to that trade, so they don't have the technological advantage. They don't have boomsticks,
right?
And they don't have a lot of beaver. There's some here, but they have a lot of deer skin, which was, there's a shortage of leather in Europe, and at its height, there were like 100,000 deer skins in the 1770s. There was 100,000 deer skins being exported from Charleston, South Carolina, every year.
Wow!
So it's big business, and it's their way of life now. And it becomes to the point where they are dependent on that system. They have, after so many decades of doing this, you lose that skill. I kind of remember how to make a bow, but I've had a gun now for years.
Right.
I kind of remember how to knap flint, but why would I do that? I just trade for a steel knife.
Yeah.
So they become dependent. So what happens is a combination of factors here in the Ohio Valley is that you have, and we found the archaeological record shows that there are village sites and occupation sites in the upper Ohio Valley where you find European trade goods. Okay, so that means they had contact, maybe not with Europeans, but with people who had middlemen who brought them stuff.
Right.
Well, what travels with the stuff? Microbes. Okay, so you have people who are impacted by disease, even though they have never even seen European, but they're dying from their diseases. Yeah. Okay. Followed by this wave of the Iroquois, the Senecas, Cayugas, Onondagas. They're coming down in here, and they're kicking the crap out of people because they want to push them out. They want the trapping lands. They want the territory for commercial purposes, basically. And so what happens? It's called the Beaver Wars. There is a name for this in the 1650s through 1680s, about a 30 or 40 year period where the Iroquois are in the upper Ohio Valley. They push. By the way, we're talking about the Shawnee. When the first contact is made in the upper Ohio Valley, the principal travel group in the upper Ohio Valley were the Shawnee, who are an Algonquian-speaking people who are related to the other Algonquian peoples in the east. But they are the ones who are here then. I mean, we can go back and talk about through time who's been, because this valley has changed so much over thousands and thousands of years, and different peoples have been here. The people who built the mounds were not the Shawnee. Okay, these were people who lived here 2,000, 2,500 years ago. Okay, these are different peoples. But at contact, and by the way, the first contact were the French who came down through the valley, and this was in the late 17th century, so late 1600s. First boats of, now I'm not talking about Celeron, who comes in the 1740s and plants the lead plates along the creeks.
Yeah.
Much earlier than that, the French are doing little sorties and missions down. They're checking it out.
Yeah.
La Belle Riviere, they call it, the beautiful river. And so who are they encountering? They're encountering the Shawnee. They record that. So we know first contact was with the Shawnee. But so the Shawnee are kind of chased out of the valley.
Yeah.
They're kind of spread out. You know, some of the Zanes show up and there's not many people here. Well, there's a reason for that.
Yeah.
They've either died from disease or they've been pushed out. But, you know, when I think about the history of the Upper Ohio Valley and our region here in Wheeling, Steubenville, Martins Ferry, I like to take a millennial perspective. I like to think back, you know, thousands of years to what it would have been like. And it would have been so much different than we think of it now, in so many ways.
Yeah.
I mean, this was an important place. And if you reference Charles Mann's book 1491, there's a map there that shows the beginning and the spread of the mound building culture. And mound builders were multiple ethnic groups who adopted the similar custom of mound building. Most people use it as a burial mound. Some people use it for astronomical purposes. They adapt it to their culture and their ethnicity, but as it was a practice which spread out. The epicenter of that practice was right here.
Really?
Right here in the Upper Ohio Valley. And that tradition, I mean, they call them, you know, the Adena. We don't know what they call themselves. And by the way, these are different tribal peoples, different languages, different cultures. But they become the Hopewell, which, you know, these people we call the Hopewell, where they picked it up a notch. They became more complex in their religion and their ceremonialism and their objects and their mound building. But the epicenter of that started right here in the Upper Ohio Valley. Wow. And it spreads as far west as Iowa. It spreads as far north as the Great Lakes. You know, I've been to Peterborough, Ontario, and had Native people take me to mounds there. There is a serpent mound outside of Peterborough, Ontario, just like the serpent mound that's in Ohio.
Yeah,
it's in Ohio. And so that tradition, which becomes shared and spreads with that religion, with that ceremonialism eventually, the Hopewell Ceremonial Complex spreads wide and far. Okay, but where did it begin? You're sitting in it right now.
Wow,
you're at the base of it. So obviously, the Upper Ohio Valley was an important place, particularly about 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago. Okay, but let's go back even further than that. Okay,
I love it.
You don't have to go very far. Avella, PA is right upside of Wellsburg, okay? There's a place called Meadowcroft Rock Shelter up there. Meadowcroft Rock Shelter is considered one of the oldest, if not the oldest, archaeological site in North America. They think that, you know, they being archaeologists, anthropologists, believe that it could have been used, continuous occupation use. It was a rock shelter, so it wasn't.
I've heard of this place. Yeah.
16,000 years.
Wow.
16,000 years, which is the oldest documented site in North America, and it's right up the river.
Wow.
It's right up. We can leave Wheeling. We can be there in 40 minutes.
Wow. And probably one of the oldest in the world. I mean, for that matter, 16,000 years.
It is. It's a National Historic Landmark. But there has been discussion there is a designation called a World Heritage Site designation. There's been talk of that as well. Cahokia, that I mentioned, the city in St. Louis is up for that type of designation as well. But that's what I'm saying. When you get in your car and you're driving up Route 2 and you're going through Beach Bottom, or you're going, you know, all these places, and you're looking around, you're saying, wow, that's pretty. You know, you could build a house there. Yeah, somebody did probably thousands of years ago. The fact, I mean, that's 16,000 years, put it in perspective, which is interesting,
it's
too.
Hard to even think in those terms.
It's the 16 millennia,
wow.
Okay? We're talking deep history now, okay?
Yeah.
So we are newcomers to this valley, okay? This has been used by people for a long, long time. And so that's the perspective I try to convey. I try to convey to my students and to others that sense of deep time. And that this was a controlled, managed landscape for many, many thousands of years. Think about what that landscape looked like. Consider the virgin forest. If you go to the West Virginia Regional History Collection at WVU, they have several photographs of the timber industry in the 19th century when they clear cut the whole damn state. They cut it all. But to imagine that virgin forest as it was. When Ebenezer Zane and when the Zanes and McCulloughs, when they all showed up in Wheeling, what did it look like? There were trees, that 4 or 5 people could stand in front of the trunk and reach out. There's a picture of the largest tree ever felled in West Virginia. It was in Tucker County. There are about 8 men. There's the big gash that they start in the front of it, and there are 8 men standing in the gash.
Wow.
At the trunk of this tree. And they cut it up in pieces. It took an entire train to move this one tree.
Oh my goodness.
That was the largest, but you get my point.
Yeah.
We cannot conceive of what the landscape was like then.
Yeah.
There's and then they come in and they cut it all. There's a photograph at Independence Hall up in the library, and it's from 1909. It's a panorama shot of Wheeling taken from across the river, probably from Bridgeport up on the hill. And so it's a panorama of Wheeling. And you look at, and this is 1909, you look at the hills, and the first thing I notice is that there are no damn trees. Not any.
They're all gone.
They're gone. They are all gone. To the point where you can look at the hills and see the erosion lines and channels running down the hillsides where the topsoil is just washing off. It's just washing off because they took it all. They took it all. So we can't even begin to imagine the landscape here. And the canopy, what it would have been like. There are points in the forest, it would have been in midday sun, you would have been in complete darkness.
Wow. From
the canopy in summertime, when everything's leafed out.
Yeah.
Try to place yourself in that perspective. And I think about things like, Wheeling Island. What an important place. What I want to know, what I'm very curious about, what I don't know anything about, is when people started to develop that island, what did they dig up on that island?
Yeah.
Because I can tell you, I've been to Parkersburg. I've been to Blennerhassett Island, okay? Over across the river in town, there's the Blennerhassett Museum. On the first floor of that museum that is dedicated to objects they found on the island. It's an entire floor of objects.
Wow.
We're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of objects, and this is just what they have on display, not what they have in storage, that came out of that island. I'm guaranteeing you that Wheeling Island is the same way.
Yeah.
To this day, and I'd be surprised anybody who listens to this that lives on the island, when you go out to dig a garden plot in your back, look at the dirt.
Yeah.
And when they started to develop things like the casino, the racetracks, what did they dig up? What did they find? Did anybody document it? Where did it go? Because I'm going to tell you right now that island is polluted with artifacts.
Wow.
Because, again, 16,000 years of people in the Ohio Valley.
Well, that friend of mine, he collected arrowheads. And there's a field, I live in Barton, and there's a road between Barton and Blaine. And it's got a nice, he had said that it was like a natural, because of the geography, it had been a settlement for generations and generations. And so every year when they would plow that field, he'd go down there and he had cases of arrowheads and artifacts that he pulled out of just this one spot.
Everywhere. And
it was the first time that the thought that for thousands of years people had been inhabiting this area. And then I just recently, within the last year, heard that there was a cave near that area that unfortunately gas and oil came through, and the deal was originally that they would preserve the cave because it was similar, to had been used for generations.
Sure.
And but then they offered them. It was easier to take the cave out, so they offered them a chunk of money, and of course they destroyed it. So I hope that the cave you were talking about, it can be preserved.
You talking about Meadowcroft?
Yeah.
Oh, hell yeah.
You already can't go in there now, right?
There is a structure built over top of it.
Okay, that's
to protect. Yeah, there's a structure. It is a satellite site of the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh.
Oh, okay.
So the Heinz
History
Heinz History Center runs. There's the site itself, and then there's an historic village, Meadowcroft Village there. So there's a whole historic site there. It's worth a trip, man, up the river if you ever have time. But they have specific tours of the rock shelter, and you walk up and you're on a platform and you look out and see. And what's really interesting about the story is it starts in the early 19th century when a guy noticed a gopher hole, a groundhog hole, and he noticed some stuff that had come out of the hole, and he kind of started digging into the hole, and he gets down into it. He starts to uncover more. He uncovers this whole damn rock shelter.
Oh, wow.
And here it is. And now people have been studying Meadowcroft for a long, long time. There's one particular gentleman who's associated with the University of Pittsburgh, who's been taking students and others there for a long, long time. So yeah, Meadowcroft. I got no worries about Meadowcroft. It's always there's not an amount of oil and gas money that will ever buy that. Or,
that's good.
And unfortunately, the story you tell about the cave is all too familiar.
Yeah.
When you think about Moundsville, you go down and visit Grave Creek, and you go upstairs on the second floor, and they've got there's an illustrative map that shows you where all the mounds used to be. I mean, Moundsville was covered with not just the giant mound, not the Grave Creek mound, but mounds all over. There's that little one that's still behind Calcane Farmstead as you drive down across from John Marshall High School. There's a little one there, but they were everywhere. Not only that, there were causeways, there were walls built that went down from the main mound down to the river. But all that's Elizabethtown, later mound. When that was developed, they took it all down.
Wow.
They took it all down. And there was no real, it was a curiosity of the people in the 19th century, but they didn't really care. That's what happened to a lot of sites. But there's a lot of interesting stories from the valley when it comes to caves and things like that. I was reading in the 19th century, it was a big thing for people to travel and write about it. They called it travelogues. That was a thing in the 19th century.
And that brought about a question that I had kind of on the tip of my tongue, because when I spoke to Hal, he was talking about how for his research he would go to the library and read newspapers.
Yeah.
And that's how he would piece things together. But obviously, this is a much earlier, and I was curious. So travelogues is how you get a lot of this information.
Yeah, there are some stories that come from travel. This one in particular, I was thinking about. This gentleman's traveling upriver. He's traveling up the Ohio on a boat, and they stop at various places, and he's writing about his travels. And they stop in Steubenville. And so he's walking through downtown Steubenville, and he sees this kid walking down the sidewalk, and the kid's got a skull, and he's kind of tossing the skull around. He's like, son, where'd you get this skull? And he's like, well, there's a whole bunch of them across the river. So on the other side of the river from Steubenville, the West Virginia side now, they had been up on the hillside excavating sandstone to be used for building materials. And they uncovered this giant burial tomb, or a cairn, I think C-A-I-R-N, a burial tomb. Mm-hmm. And it had something like over 300 burials in it, and stone pipes and various objects. And he's like, yeah, you can go over there and you just get one for yourself. People are going over there. And so he goes over and he investigates and he talks to some people. And they had just uncovered this cave with 300 some burials and objects just a few days before, and when this guy got there, it was all gone.
Oh, wow.
People had all come. It was curiosities and objects and skulls, and they just came. They took it all. But this was a burial cave up on the side of the mountain on the Ohio River. There's stuff all over this valley that we've yet to discover that's underneath our feet, particularly on the ridge tops. A lot of people think about they think intuitively that your major settlements are going to be in the river bottoms, and that's where you're going to raise your crops and put your villages. And no, not necessarily, because the fact is the cooler air settles in the valleys. And so what native people did early on is they would plant and live on the ridges, because if you plant on the ridge, you actually have a longer growing season because the cooler air settles in the valleys. So when you want to look for stuff, you're going to find it in the river bottoms, but don't forget the tops of the ridges. Yeah. That's where a lot of people were living and planting and raising their crops. And the
river would flood, so you.
Oh yeah, there's always that too. Yeah.
That's fascinating, because I would have naturally assumed that would be right there along the water, that would be the last place it would be, is on top of the hill. So that's very interesting.
Absolutely. So that's where a lot of the settlement sites were. They were up on the ridges, and but again, the river was life. It was your major transportation route. It was your highway. Freshwater mussels, when you could eat out of the river, were a major food source for native people, as well as the fish. At one point you could even drink out of the Ohio River, but or in the streams, Wheeling Creek. But I wouldn't suggest that today. Yeah. But that's kind of how the landscape was used, and that was kind of how people lived here for thousands and thousands of years, and developing complex mound building societies and structures. And when I drive around the valley and I see certain points of interest or a hillside or a creek, and I would think, I wonder what stories were told about this place.
Yeah.
What stories were told that were passed down about what happened here thousands and thousands of years ago that became legend to Native people. Because the oral tradition, was a very strong thing, still is in Native societies. Those stories were passed down until, a lot of these people who were vessels of that knowledge died, particularly in the 17th and 18th century. And so one of the points I make to my students about, the great dying and all these diseases and the decimation from disease is that, how much knowledge was lost. I mean, because in Native societies, there are particular people who are chosen at a very young age to be the vessels of this knowledge. You are trained. That's your job. Your job
is to
remember this stuff, and you are going to be tested on. They would tell you the story. Repeat it. No, you got that wrong. Repeat it. You forgot this. Repeat it. Repeat it. Repeat it. And that's your job. Yeah. Your job is to carry that knowledge. And so, what happened when those people got wiped out? What happened to the holes that those left? People they lost it. Okay, they lost it. Stuff that it's gone now forever. And then you start to think about things like the generational trauma that comes from an event like that. Yeah. You think about the century of the 16th century, the 1700s. You think about the trauma that came out of that century for Native peoples when millions, literally, I'm not shitting you, millions of people died. Yeah. What does that do to your psyche? What does that do to your, and they've
9 out of 10 people in the community dies.
They're gone.
And you're one of the remaining people. It's a whole different world.
And what do you do?
Yeah.
Hopefully you'll find hopefully you'll find another group of people who will take you in. Who will take you in. And so, again, all that happened well before the Zanes and well before Fort Henry. That had already happened.
And you said that you hope they take you in because it wasn't necessarily that the neighbors, just because they were also Native Americans,
that doesn't mean they were your friends.
They were your friends.
Yeah, not necessarily.
They could definitely not be your friends.
Yeah. But human beings in history is always so much more complex. I always kid with my Cherokee friends in North Carolina. They gave me a bunch of crap because this is Shawnee territory, and so, but I was like, hey man, look at the history. Sometimes the Shawnee lived with you. Sometimes they killed you. Sometimes they married you. Sometimes they slit your throat, just like real family does.
Right.
So it's much more complex.
And that's something I've heard, and you would know if it's how true it is that. When the white people went to live with the Native Americans, they rarely wanted to come back if they were a deserter. Yeah. But when it was the other way around, it didn't work so good.
There's a whole genre of literature, captivity narratives. There are numbers and numbers of captivity narratives, many from this region. And so that's typically what happened. You have these usually if there's a raid. The idea that, they're bloodthirsty and they want to kill everybody. No, if they can capture you and take you back, that is one of their principal objectives because they are losing people. They need people. Yeah. If a European on the frontier died, there were 10 people to replace him. If a Native person died, there was nobody to fill that hole. Yeah. And so they were trying to assimilate people. Escaped slaves, runaway slaves were taken in. They were much more an inclusivist societies than were European societies. And so, a lot of these people went native, for lack of a better term. One of my great-grandfathers, his name was Jeremiah Carpenter, and his brother Benjamin, Jeremiah Benjamin Carpenter, they're considered they're the first white settlers of what is now Webster and Nicholas counties, West Virginia. And when Jeremiah was 9, they were right across the Allegheny Ridge in what is now Covington, Virginia, on the Jackson River. When he was 9, living on the Jackson River, he was captured by the Shawnee, and he was taken to Shawnee Old Town, which there were like 3 or 4 Shawnee Old Towns, so I don't know which one. But for the next 10 years, he lives with the Shawnee.
Wow.
And then he ends up coming back to what is now West Virginia, and I'm not sure if he was repatriated, if he escaped, or how he ended up back, but this is after 10 years. And damn, 9 to 19, he's acculturated at this point. He is Shawnee.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but he makes his way back, and interestingly enough, he ends up, 2 years later, he ends up fighting against the Shawnee at the Battle of Point Pleasant, which I always thought was pretty interesting because These are the people he had just lived with for 10 years. So yeah, you find that the people who are assimilated in the native culture, particularly women, particularly women who come from societies where they have no standing, in societies where women have power, they tend not to want to come back. You get the children, you acculturate them early. They don't want to go back. That doesn't work for Native people who were taken into white society. I think about all these Indian schools. There was one in Williamsburg. There was one at Dartmouth College was founded as an Indian. Harvard had an Indian school. And, these young men are taken into European society. They cannot wait to get back. And there's a great quote by one of the Iroquois folks when their sons come back from the Harvard school. They're like, you send them back, they're worthless to us. They make noise in the woods. They can't hunt. They can't take care of themselves. They're like, send us some of your boys, and we will make men of them.
Right.
So that happened quite often, and you read these treaty negotiations after major battles like Point Pleasant in 1774, and incidents like during the Revolution, Fort Henry, people get captured, and there's following negotiations. And the one thing that the Europeans say, the Virginians, Pennsylvanians, we need our people back.
Right.
We want them back. I think of Bouquet in 1764, Henry Bouquet, who comes out to fight against the Ohio Valley tribes in what's called Pontiac's War, as part of Pontiac's War in 1763-64, and the children have to be drug away from their native parents, kicking and screaming, because they don't want to go back. They don't want. They've become acculturated. They don't want to go back. And again, like I said with women, a lot of these native societies are matrilineal. The ownership of the lands, the ownerships of the stuff, the ownership of, the clan membership of your children is all determined by your mother's line. Your children are born into your mother's clan.
Right.
They inherit their mother, and it's not their father that trains them on hunting and fishing and warfare. It's their uncles, because their uncles are of their mother's clan. If she wants a divorce, all she has to do is set his shit outside the house, and it's done. He knows to go back to he goes back to his mother's clan.
Yeah.
And I had a colleague of mine in graduate school who he wanted to argue with me. He's like, yeah. He's like, but there's a difference between power and influence. I said, okay, let's think about this for a second. Let's think about Iroquois clan mothers. Iroquois clan mothers pick the leaders when they're boys. They train them. They put them into position. If they don't like what they do, they take them out of position. These are women who can literally control life or death. The prisoners brought in. They decide, live or die. Okay. So you control all government appointments. You have the power of life and death. You own all the property. So that's a little bit more than influence. Okay. And so, which was it was completely foreign concept to Europeans. It will always crack me up because you'd have like treaty negotiations at Fort Pitt up in Pittsburgh. 1775 was a big one. And so, the Pennsylvanians and Virginians, they show up to the negotiations. And so the Shawnee and the Delaware and all these other folks, they show up, and they've got their women with them. There's a whole group of them. They bring their kids too, but they bring their women. And one of the questions they ask where are your women? Because they couldn't conceive that you're about to make major decisions without the input of your women. Where are your women? So that perspective, that disparate perspective, always really cracked me up when I read that.
It really was a completely different culture or way of life in just about every way than what the Europeans had been accustomed to.
Absolutely.
Which I guess maybe not living that lifestyle, but I have a certain fondness for it. It seems like it would be more of an ideal way to live.
Yeah, but don't wax too far.
Yeah.
Because there's this nostalgia. There are two basic stereotypes when it comes to Native people. there's the savage, the savage Indian, violent, bloodthirsty, and then there's the think about that 1970s commercial, the environmental commercial.
The Kumbaya.
Where there's the Indian with the teardrop coming out of his eye, and there's the ecological Indian.
Right, exactly.
Which is
probably what I identify with.
The whole New Age movement gravitates towards that other stereotype. So I mean, these were people who impacted their land. They practiced slash and burn agriculture. It's not like they were completely environmental. They definitely impacted their environment. So there's this tendency to,
because I've heard people say that they didn't believe in ownership, but then you even said that they own land
well, not in the European sense,
right?
It was understood that we are using this area. This is our area to use now.
Yeah.
If we decide we don't want to use it and we leave it, you want to come later, it's yours to use. But for right now, this is understood to be our area. That's understood to be your area.
Yeah.
We hunt here, you hunt there. One of the principal things that really pissed Indians off in the Ohio Valley in particular was when Virginians in particular, because Virginians and the Ohio Valley people went at it because there was no more aggressively expansion of people than the Virginians, okay? Yeah. Our ancestors here in West Virginia. Pennsylvanians, yes, somewhat, but the Virginians were very aggressive. But they were coming out here and they were killing all the damn deer.
Yeah.
I mean, and it wasn't. And here's the thing that really pissed them off is you weren't just killing. It wasn't you were killing it to eat and feed your family. There's a lot of commercial hunters. I mean, again, the fur trade's a big business, not just for Native people, for everybody.
Yeah.
So these guys, they called them long hunters. Long hunters would come out here, and they would commercial hunt, and they would kill all the damn deer because they wanted the pelts.
Yeah.
The pelts were for trade for stuff. Okay, that. Deerskin was the currency of the frontier. That was your money. You didn't have gold or silver or cash or coin. You traded in deerskin. That's what you used. And by the way, you still talk about it today.
You got $1.
How much is that? $5.
Yeah.
It costs $5.
I never knew that was the actual origin.
You still talk about it today.
Yeah.
Because that's how big the economy. That's how big this business was.
Yeah.
Okay. But it's pissing the Indians off that you're coming out here and killing all our deer. It's understood. This is our area. Daniel Boone's son is captured one time, and the Shawnee, they show great restraint. They tell him, now, brother, you're not supposed to be out here.
Yeah.
We're going to let you go this time. He comes out again. It doesn't work out very well for him. He gets killed the second time. So there's not ownership in the European sense. Okay, and when I think about later Shawnee, one of the great descendants of the Ohio Valley people is a Shawnee named Tecumseh. And Tecumseh, his whole idea for a pan-Indian resistance, was that, all tribes start to see their lands held in common. These are all our lands. Yeah. We have to have a unified front. And nobody's going to sell to anybody, any European, without the consent of everybody. So a different concept of land ownership by far.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's what you're using at the time. And it's understood. You're using it right now. Later on, we don't want it anymore. You can use it.
Yeah, that's it is a unique perspective, and it's interesting. Even how much I can't say that I pay attention to it a lot, but how much I assumed either the wrong thing or heard the wrong thing, or that the history's been maligned or presented in a.
Well, it had to be.
Yeah,
it's very There's a splinter that's into the skin of the history of this country, and it festers. It's underneath, and it's there, and everybody can feel it. They can feel it. It's under their skin, and they can feel it. It's starting to fester. Okay, and we haven't dealt with it yet. And I look at some of the issues that we have today. It's because we haven't dealt with our history properly. Yeah. We haven't just come to terms with how this country was founded. It's a stolen continent that was built on the back of slave labor. I mean, that's our history.
Right.
So there's a dark underside, to the American dynasty, but the Native aspect of that is perhaps the biggest. And
I know that there's an interesting story locally of how the Indians were baited basically into a war. Right? They. Oh
yeah, they won it. Lord Dunmore's War, as 1774. Was absolutely facilitated and brought about for a land grab. Yeah. It was the Virginians wanted a war so that they could come into the Ohio Valley and take this area. And a principal event of that had to deal with a guy named Logan.
Okay.
And it happened if you go up to where Mountaineer Casino is, near the edge of their parking lot, near the river, was a tavern called Baker's Tavern. Baker being the proprietor of that establishment. And across the valley, on the other side of the river, were villages of Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo Indians. By the way, can I make a real quick point?
Yeah.
I mentioned Mingo Indians. Up here on the top of the hill in Wheeling, we have a Mingo statue. There were no such thing as Mingo Indians. Okay, I'm going to say it again. There were no such thing as Mingo. There, in the records, you might come across the reference to Mingo, okay? They weren't Mingos. Mingo was a term. Mingo was a term, an Iroquoian word, a term for people who are wanderers or vagrants, okay?
Ah.
It was somewhat derogatory, and it was applied to the Senecas, Cayugas, and Onondagas, Iroquoian peoples who came to the Ohio Valley because they had been displaced, dispossessed, and pissed off enough that they left Western Pennsylvania, New York State, and they came out to the Ohio Valley to get away from Europeans. Okay, that's why they came here. And the other Iroquoian folks called them, and some of the other Mingos. They weren't. There's no such thing as a Mingo.
Yeah.
So I don't want to. I hate to destroy cherished things like the Mingo statue. There is no such thing, And
but it's good. It's better that we cherish the truth.
Cherish the truth. Yeah, and question it too.
Sure.
Because can I make? Let me say something else too.
Yeah, go
There's
ahead.
a lot of great stories from our frontier history that have to do with Native people and Wheeling, the Ohio Valley. One of the most endearing ones that people cling to is at McCulloch's Leap.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay,
that's probably the oldest one that I know.
When I walk over the hill to Generations, I'll walk past McCulloch's Leap, and there's a little tablet there that talks about it, and you see illustrations of it. Okay, let me ask you this question. Have you ever thought of this? Okay, besides Sam McCulloch and his horse, who was there to witness the leap? The Indians? Did they go back to Fort Henry and say, hey, that crazy son of a bitch?
Yeah, went down over the hill.
Or did Sam McCulloch show up at the fort and be like, hey, you aren't going to believe this.
Right.
I mean, yeah, no, I'm fine. The horse is fine.
Yeah.
But it was like 400 feet.
Yeah.
Who told that story? Sam McCulloch told that story.
Right.
So, I mean, I'm not trying to, I'm just saying question things.
Right.
Who told the story?
Right.
It had to be Sam.
Yeah.
Because the Indians didn't tell the story. Okay, but I'm just saying, I'm not trying to poo-poo anything that's, very...
Well, it is funny because when you think about it, the idea that someone with a horse, when you look down over the hill there...
There's no
that
way,
you can
man, I'm telling you right
that.
now. It's a great story, like Washington and the cherry tree is just not a lot of validity.
No, and especially I think with Native Americans, the saying that, the ones that win are the ones that get to write the history is kind of
always very true.
Yeah, it's so true, especially probably more so in this case than most.
It's very true. Yeah, absolutely. And so, yeah, it's there's a great history here when it comes to. But here's the other thing: there's so much of the history that is known is violent and it's bloody, and case in point, to get back to Baker's Tavern. In 1774, the Virginians, the Shawnee weren't going to give up the lands in the upper Ohio Valley. That river, they had enough was enough. That river was the line. The Ohio River, you will go no further. Yeah. You're not going to go any further. Okay, so the only way that the Virginians were going to facilitate this is to goad them into war. Okay, and there's it's called the threat of war tactic. Michael McConnell, who's a scholar of the period, he terms it the threat of war tactic. Okay, and it starts here in the Ohio Valley. Okay, it was used to some extent earlier too, but it really starts in 1774 in the Upper Ohio Valley. And this is what you do: you instigate, you provoke the Indians until they have no choice but to retaliate, and then it's there's an Indian war. Yeah. There's an uprising. Everybody mount up, okay? And so then you come in with your army and you either kick the crap out of them and force them to the treaty table, or by your show of force, you bring them to the treaty table, and in that treaty, they invariably cede land, okay? The threat of war, there's a process. There's steps to it. It started here in the valley, okay? And when you look at it, it is exactly how manifest destiny carries itself all the way across all the way to California.
Wow.
It's the same process that carries it up, but it's in Michael McConnell, he points this out. But it starts here in the Upper Ohio Valley, and it starts at Baker's Tavern because there was a family of a Mingo. He was actually a Cayuga named Logan, who, by the way, had a French father. He was half white, light-skinned, and could speak English and French. Did you know that?
Did not know that.
You do now. Yeah. In fact, during one of his raids, he writes a letter to his to whoever he lived. The very famous. It's in a collection in Ohio. The very famous Logan War Club. After an attack, a retaliation, he leaves a note that said, he writes it, "The Indians are not angry, only myself," because he's trying to point out to whoever finds this note, this is retribution for his family. So what happens at Baker's Tavern? So April 1774, Logan's family, his brother, his daughter, and her daughter, his daughter's child, who had a white father named John Gibson, and a couple other of his relatives are with a group of Mingos, or Senecas and Cayugas, who were at Baker's Tavern. They had known the proprietor. They drank there before. So they're there, and a group of men led by a gentleman named Daniel Greathouse. These guys had already been causing mischief in the valley. Earlier, the night before, they had fired upon some Indians trying to get some stuff going, just to get a fight going.
Yeah.
Okay. And in fact, they killed one the night before. Killed a Seneca. And so they're at the tavern that day. They're getting drunk with the Indians. Everybody's having a good time. And they invite the Indians out for what was a frontier sport, which was the shoot at a mark, marksmanship, shoot at a mark. And so the Indians, go with Greathouse and a few men outside. Very graciously, they allow the Indians to fire first, emptying their guns, and then men who had all been hidden in the bushes outside of Baker's Tavern proceed to basically massacre these people.
Wow!
And then later on the day, some other Senecas and Cayugas come across in canoes to see where these people have been, what's going on. They kill them too. Altogether, there were 15 people killed that day at Baker's Tavern. Okay, why was this done? Because Greathouse, his men, the Virginians, all knew, and he wasn't the only one. There were other people up and down the valley who were precipitating violence. They understood the Indian form of justice. It's what I call corporate responsibility, or what's often referred to as the morning war. And what do I mean by corporate responsibility? Corporate responsibility means if you kill somebody from my family or my clan or my town, it is incumbent upon me to kill somebody from your family, your clan, or your town. Okay, it doesn't have to be you, because it's not about retribution. It's about balance.
Yeah,
it's about balance. Okay, which is a different concept of justice. Okay,
right.
But what they knew is that when they hit these people and killed the 15 of them at the tavern, there would be retribution. That's what they're going to capitalize on. That's what they're going to. That's going to be their PR piece.
Yeah.
Okay. And certainly the Pennsylvania newspapers, when Logan and the family members of those killed began their retaliations that summer, the Virginia newspapers, the Pennsylvania Gazette, they all run with it, and it's an Indian uprising, and that's why two armies are mounted, and the Battle of Point Pleasant happens in October down in Point Pleasant, West Virginia. This whole war erupts. And what happens is, the Shawnee in 75, a year later, are forced at treaty negotiations with Fort Pitt to cede the Ohio Valley. But that's what they wanted.
Yeah.
Okay, they precipitated that violence. So you instigate, provoke. Why were they savage? Because they were made to be.
Yeah.
They were made to be. 1777, the year of the Bloody Sevens. Oh my God. People still tell stories about how horrible the Indian attacks were in 1777. You know what happened before that? Well, Cornstalk, the principal chief of the Shawnee, goes to Fort Randolph at Point Pleasant. He knows that he doesn't want trouble. So he goes to let the Virginians know, hey, there's some Shawnees down in the lower towns, down near Parkersburg, across the river, Marietta. They're itching for a fight, and I want you to know there might be some trouble, but I want you to know it's just them.
Yeah.
It's just them. Okay, what do? They keep Cornstalk at Fort Randolph, and another group of whites show up a little bit later and murder him and his son. Well, they just murdered Cornstalk. Yeah. So hell yeah, the frontier was on fire, man. The year of the blood, they hit the frontier. They're coming up here at Fort Henry. I mean, they're lighting them up because there's always. So it's interesting when you look at native attacks. Typically they are precipitated. Yeah. There is something that sets them off. They don't just wake up in the morning and say, "Hey, let's go kill Whitey." Yeah. There's something that precipitates this.
And if you look at the grand total of everything that happened, you realize how incredibly patient they were. That they're looking across the river and there's all these people that are occupying the land that used to be theirs, and they're, hey, just don't come any farther. We're cool. Don't
you have enough at this point? You have enough. And I think about that. I think about the Shawnee people who were the people of the Upper Ohio Valley. This was their traditional homeland, in the 1600s, 1700s. They were the people here. When I think about, they began to have skirmishes with white Virginians, in particular, sometimes Pennsylvanians, in the 1740s. And Tecumseh is fighting against Virginians and Pennsylvanians during the War of 1812 in 1812. So that is, what, 60? That's 70 years of conflict. That is, okay, so you have a peoples, because the Delaware, the Senecas, Cayugas. By the way, when you think of the Ohio Valley in the 1700s, Fort Henry days, that era, if I took my canoe down the Ohio River and I pulled up anywhere up, around Steubenville or wherever, and I went into one of these villages, what would it look like? Well, you probably hear 3 or 4 different languages being spoken, because these are multi-ethnic communities. This is essentially, the Upper Ohio Valley is a land of refugees. Yeah. You have the Shawnees, who have always been here, but then you have the displaced Lenape, or Delaware. By the way, Wheeling is a Delaware Indian word. And they're all living together. So you have multi-ethnic villages here in the 1700s with different languages, different customs.
Wow.
That's what they were like. But I'm trying to remember what was my point with that. Well, again, thinking about the Shawnee, you got 70 years. So there are generations of Shawnee people who are born into, live their lives, and know nothing but violence.
Yeah. Nothing
but violence and stress and anxiety. And I think about, Tecumseh, who is one of the most heralded Native leaders of all time. I think he's a product of that era. His father, he was 6 years old when his father was killed at Point Pleasant in 1774. He hated the Virginians. Yeah. They killed his father. They killed his family. So it's, there's that, the times make the person, or the person make the times? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
Both,
right?
Yeah. And so he is a product of that era of 7 decades of violence.
Wow. So, and there had been a period where, before they got here, but they knew that they were coming, right? That they had heard that when they show up, they're like, oh crap, now it's at our doorstep.
Yeah.
And I don't think that, we're so used to, if something bad happens, you get a flat tire, someone steals your car stereo or something, and we think we've been violated. But I don't think that in our comfortable, air-conditioned, heated lifestyle that we can even imagine. Because, a lot of people got annoyed with all the gas and oil people moving into the area. Sure. But imagine if they moved into the area, but they didn't just move in and work and rents go up, but they just saw your car and they said, well, I want that car, and your laws don't apply to me. Yeah, and
I'm going to take your house.
Yeah, I'm going to go to this grocery store and take the food out.
Right.
And no, I'm not paying for it. And by the way, I'm taking your house, and go find somewhere else to live. And we can't. Even as you're talking about it, and my brain's trying to assimilate it in like modern terms, what that would be like. It would be an absolute Holocaust. It would be hell on earth.
Absolutely.
So what I just said 10 minutes ago, that they showed incredible restraint. Just even in the last 10 minutes, I'm realizing how much restraint that they didn't want to absolutely just kill every white person that they saw.
No, and that's the narrative. That is the principal narrative. That's the narrative of bad Hollywood movies.
Yeah,
where all you see is the savage Indian. John Wayne. And, that was all violence and savagery. Man, that's what was portrayed. But this is very, very important. This is very important. There is the other side of that. And this is what we don't see in Hollywood movies, and what we don't hear about in our textbooks. Is that the cultural sharing, the intermarriage. I mean, there's a reason that there are millions of people in this country who have Native ancestry somewhere in their background.
That's a very good point.
Okay, because somebody loves somebody. Okay.
Yeah, that assimilation. I hadn't even really thought about that too much until you just mentioned it.
Absolutely, there are millions of people who have Native ancestry in this country. And so, if you go to to that point, if you go to the National Museum of the American Indian in D.C., there is an exhibit area called Our Peoples. And as you enter into this section of the museum, you walk through these long walls of screens, like movie screens, elongated screens, and you have life-size people who are walking along with you. Some are going this way and that way, and they're walking beside you. And you see this guy wearing a three-piece suit, and he's got lighter skin, and you see this person in kind of traditional regalia with darker skin, and there's a whole mix of looking people. They're trying to make a point to you, and their point is you walk past native people or native descended people all the time, and you don't even realize it, okay? But that's the other side of the story, the cultural sharing, the intermarriage, what we have learned from each other, what we have shared with each other. Yeah. It's not all about violence. That's the narrative everybody knows. That's the story you're always fed.
That violence sells, right? It's the front page.
That's all it is, man.
People getting along, that's back page.
Absolutely.
Below the fold.
But that's true. I mean, there was a lot of, and Native people, they survived. They intermarried. If you could pass for white, by God, you did.
Yeah.
Okay. In our family, my mother's mother, my grandmother, would tell her, be careful digging up your roots. You might not like what you find. Okay. Yeah. Because it was things that were known about, but you don't talk about that. You don't talk about that. It wasn't really, when you think about it, I think about my generation. It's okay now. It's okay for us to talk about it and say, this is part of our family history. Yeah. This is part of our heritage. It's okay now. It's cool. Yeah. It's cool. I mean, hippies came along in the 60s. Yeah. Shit, it's cool to be Indian, man. Yeah. But before that, it was not cool to be Indian. And by God, if you could hide it, you did. Yeah. A good friend of mine, Eastern Band Cherokee fella, he's the director of the Cherokee Museum down there now. But he'll tell you the story about growing up. He didn't want to be Indian. He didn't want people to know he was Indian. He was embarrassed to be Indian. Until one day he had this epiphany and he accepted who he was and his culture, and he became really interested in it. Yeah. And now he's the director of their museum now. But that was kind of the thing. And the fact that Native people have survived, that they're still here, that there are 564 federally recognized tribes, not including state recognized tribes, which are everywhere. West Virginia does not have one. Ohio has one, the United Remnant Band of Shawnee. Pennsylvania has 10 now. I'm not Pennsylvania. Virginia has 10. As far as I know, Kentucky and PA do not have any.
Why is that they have 10, and it's just because we haven't in Ohio taken the time to?
What there's in Virginia, certain areas people still banded together. Like I think about the Monacan Indians over in the western part of the state near Shenandoah Valley. They had their cultural group and culture area. There was these various, social scientists call them triracial isolates. Triracial isolates. There's these groups of people historically throughout Appalachia and in Virginia and elsewhere who are these ethnic enclaves, and they've survived. They're still there, and they kind of stick to themselves. Okay. There's a group outside of Philippi in Barber County, West Virginia, called the Guineas. And the Guineas have been there since the 1790s, and they are a mixture of Native people, white, European, and African American people, triracial isolates. Melungeons are another group. Brass Ankles, the Ramapo Mountain people of New Jersey. One of my favorites is the Weesorts people. I think they're in Maryland. The Bear Hill Bunch. All these various different groups that are descendants of these intermixtures. Mm-hmm. Okay, and they're everywhere. That's a whole, man. You want to talk about another academically hot area of study? These multi-ethnic groups that were enclaves in various areas in the eastern United States. Where did the Indians go? Well, some of them didn't go anywhere. Yeah. Some of them didn't go anywhere. Their descendants are all around you right now. But like I said, in Philippi, there's a group called the Guineas, and they've been there since the 1790s. Been there since the 1790s.
Wow, that's incredible.
So yeah, you don't know that, do you?
Yeah, yeah.
So, but when you start looking around, you start to realize, But it's amazing that these people survive, that Native people survive, that they're still here. Their cultures are vibrant. One of the most amazing days, I went to the grand opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. So I'm there on the National Mall. Most damn Indians I've ever seen in any one place ever. And just wave after waves of these delegations. And it was man, it was incredible. And you're saying, wow, look at all these native people.
Yeah.
They're still here. They're still here after 500 years of all that they've been up against. Still here. And I believe they still have a lot to teach.
Yeah.
Teach us all. I don't want to wax too philosophical on you, but, when I think about Native studies and the fact, that Native people have survived, that Native American studies is a growing, burgeoning area of study, that Native people are being more assertive about their rights and they're in the forefront. I think about Standing Rock, all that stuff that just happened out there. That was a flashpoint, man. It was like back in 1973 when Indians took Alcatraz Island and they retook Wounded Knee, and they were on CBS and NBC every night, and people went, damn, they're still Indians? What are they upset about? That they're becoming more, people are going to them to learn more now and understand more. And when I think about the trajectory that Western civilization has been on now for centuries to get us to this point, I think it's very important. And I'm thinking long history, brother. I'm thinking not just the past few hundred years, the next couple hundred years. I'm thinking in terms of a couple millennia. When you look at the broader history, how's that going to play out? Why is that important? Well, maybe it's important that these people survive because there's going to be some things they need to teach us.
Yeah.
Okay, there's going to be some things about the situation that we're in right now. We have at WVU what's called the Elder in Residence program, and this past year, our Elder in Residence was a gentleman named Orrin Lyons. His title was Faith Keeper of the Onondaga Nation up in central New York, part of the Iroquois League. And he was part of a delegation that went to the United Nations. He's spoken before them several times and works on UN working groups on indigenous rights. But Orrin Lyons was part of an indigenous group that went to the UN back in the 70s. And they brought to them what they called a basic call to consciousness. It was a document. It was their declaration to the Western world. And they were telling them things like, you better straighten up or, the environment's going to kick your ass.
Yeah.
Okay? These things are going to happen. And he came to WVU just a few months ago to speak to us, and he said, we told you 40 years ago what was going to happen, and it's starting to play out now.
Yeah.
Do you understand now? Do you see it? We've been telling you this, and so that voice is very important, and not just Native peoples of the Americas, but indigenous peoples of the world. Aboriginal Australians, African Pygmies, all these folks, all these traditional peoples who have been carrying this knowledge and this way, the relationships, what they call the good mind among the Iroquois, or right relationships, or the red road, whatever you want to call it. But the idea of the philosophy of relationship with the world. Yeah. I think that philosophy of relationship is going to be very damn important in the coming centuries.
I agree. And I think it's the thing that it probably, as I mentioned before, appeals to me the most is that idea of being more. Nature isn't something that's outside of us, but we're part of nature as much as I even, if I look up the sky, a friend of mine pointed out to me once when we were stargazing, he said that, the universe isn't something that's out there. Mm-hmm. It's something that we're a part of. We're floating through the universe. Right. We're in the universe as much as it's not something out there. And I like to think that at least from my perception is that the Native American way of living was that we're just one part of this.
Yeah.
And
everything.
Yeah.
Everything has a part-whole relationship.
Yeah.
Everything.
Yeah.
You look at neutrons and electrons, they're part of an atom. You look at those atoms, well, they're part of your liver. Yeah. You look at your liver, it's part of your body. You look at your body, it's part of this environment. You look at this environment, it's part of this world. You look at this world, it's part of the solar system, on and on. Everything has a part-whole relationship, but it's all linked.
Yeah, and I think we tend to look at it, this is ours, and everything else is, from the universe to the earth beneath us, to the animals, that it's all something outside of us that is there for us to observe or to enjoy or to use, but that we don't think of ourselves as being part of that. And I agree. I think that, and I do notice more and more, especially with young people, that they are starting to get that more.
There's a transition there, and it's timely.
Yeah,
you know,
it needs to happen quick, right?
It's timely. It's for some things it's already too late. But here's the point, and I tell this to my students, I tell this to my children. You right now, you and your children and your grandchildren, you're living in perhaps one of the most important periods in all of human history. This century is going to make or break us.
I agree.
You're in it.
Yeah.
You didn't ask for it. You might not have wanted it, but it's yours.
Yeah.
Okay. Here's the other way to look at that. Oh, this sucks. No. You are now presented with an incredible opportunity. You are the people. You are the generations that can pull it out. This heavy burden, didn't ask for it, probably didn't want it, but it's yours.
Yeah.
You know, if you subscribe to the notion you were born to certain times and places because of certain reasons, well, here you are. You're alive, brother. Look around.
Yeah.
This is what you got. Now, what are you going to do about it? You know, and what troubles me is that we realize it. You and I are talking about it right now. But you're gonna turn off your machine. We're gonna leave tonight. We gotta work tomorrow.
Yeah.
We gotta pay our bills.
Yeah.
We gotta go to the grocery store.
Yeah.
And it's just one of those things in the back of our minds. Yeah. We know it's there, but we don't. What are we going to do about it? What can I do about it? You know, and that's seems to be like the consensus. It's too big for me to deal with. Well, no, we got to take a different approach.
Well, and I think that's where I think a lot of people these days are getting dissatisfied with modern society, that you get so caught up in being convenient that you easily lose sight of those things. And you know, so many people, they go camping for a week and they think, gosh, this is, you know, cook and we get away from all that stuff, and that it gives you a chance to think about. And it is true, we're so distracted by everything from sporting events to what's on TV tonight. That
football, the opiate of the masses.
Yeah, exactly. And even to the extent of not even worrying about the environment or the big things, but just people that neglect their children that are sitting 2 feet away because they're so fixated on either keeping up with the Joneses or how am I going to get this car or who's winning the game tonight. And
how about you read the article that came out about 2-3 weeks ago? It was a panel of scientists from around the world who issued a warning, and this is the second time we've issued such a warning. And they talking about massive extinction of species. We are now in a great extinction period, the first extinction that's ever been facilitated by another species.
Yeah.
We're losing species every damn day. I mean, the change in climate, the things are. Here's what it takes, James. It takes a smack in the face.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that's it's going to have to happen.
Yeah.
Until, you know, a hurricane blows the shit out of everything and destroys everything you own and it kills your family members, until the earth shakes and Mother Earth shakes us off like we're fleas on a dog or whatever, what have you. Until we're smacked in the face, we're not really going to pay attention.
And I feel like we've been getting tapped in the face, and
there've been little jabs.
Yeah, and you wonder exactly how hard of a smack will it take for people to finally get it. Will it have to be? I guess in my personal philosophy, I think that it almost at this point needs to be catastrophic, whether an economy collapse or some virus takes over in a way that it did the Indians, where that on a grand scale everything almost has to fall apart before we can get it to where there is no football games and there is no job, and that
you're absolutely right.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel like
I hate. You know, I have children in this world, and I hate to say these things, but here's the fact of the matter. There's too many damn people.
Yeah.
And there's going to be more by 2050. We're going to be 12 billion or something like that. Too many people, not enough resources. Nobody cares. I mean, not enough people. Not enough people care. So here, this has been my take on it. And people, anybody listens to this, they might think I'm an ass or whatever, but you're exactly right. Let it all fall down. Yeah. Let it all fall down, and whoever's left picks up the pieces, and you learned, and you move on. You know, war sucks. Epidemics suck. Yeah. Well, there's too many damn people. Yeah. You know, we need a little Spanish flu outbreak. You know.
Well, unfortunately, I think that's. I actually wrote a story when filmmaking where humanity voluntarily imprisoned themselves to allow the earth to heal, and it goes on from there. But yeah, that idea that I think that something that catastrophic on that level, because as much as the most environmentally conscious people I know, they also drive cars, and you hear them post about it on Facebook. And so the level of which we would have to reject the comforts that we have to even begin to start saving things would be literally to walk away from your house, and we don't have the skills.
It won't happen. It
Yeah.
won't happen. Is scary.
Buying a Prius won't do it.
No, it's not going to.
It's not-
It might make you feel better,
Yeah.
but you recycle, and that's great. But you read, and I'm not sure how much of this is just overstated or possible, or it's been about 3-4 weeks ago, maybe a little more, about this whole idea of an electromagnetic pulse device. That if Kim Jong-un, he might not be able to pummel us with nukes, but he doesn't have to. And nobody has to. You get this nuke in the central United States, 200 miles above in the atmosphere, and you pop it off, it fries the grid.
Yeah.
It fries the freaking, and then we're done.
Never coming back.
We're
Yeah.
done.
Yeah.
That means there's no banking, there's no transportation, there's no communication. We're done.
And you think about a city like Los Angeles, where there's not enough food. It's all trucked in within days. People would start to starve, and
You'd see some nasty stuff.
it doesn't even have to be a foreign. The Earth the sun every now and then throws out a solar flare, and we've been lucky that the last time one happened, we didn't have a power grid. But that's a real concern. Yeah, when I start thinking about all the things that could happen, it's almost a matter of time.
But you can't. But here's the other thing. You can't let yourself get lost in that, because again, I have children in this world, so I have to have hope.
Yeah.
I have to have hope. They have to have hope. And so, like I said earlier, when I talk to my students, when I talk to my children, you didn't ask for it, but this is it. Yeah. You are some of the most important humans who've ever walked on this planet right now. Yeah. Look around, recognize you're in it.
And they might be the ones that figure out a way to fix it without it having to be completely reset.
I sure as hell hope so. We'll see. Well,
on that, I think the library has been very gracious to host the podcast, the last 2 podcasts, and but we are running up near closing time, and I have to tell you, fascinating conversation. So many things that I thought I knew were wrong, and so I love that I had a chance to learn the truth about things, and just it's fascinating, and I'm sure the listeners all appreciate it. And so Travis, thanks again for coming in.
Yes, sir.
And everybody, as always, thanks for listening to the podcast. Hopefully next we're going to on the next podcast, if I can get Sean Duffy in to come and talk about history, it'll be the third part in what I'm hoping will be History Month here at the podcast, and kind of something new that I'm doing here as I reboot at the beginning of the year. And as always, thank you for all of your support in the past, and keep listening in the future. And until the next time, see ya.